Hello, welcome back to the screencast for Justice as Fairness, Part 1B for Political Philosophy, Spring 2020. And I ended Part 1A trying to emphasize that philosophy is tough and not to give up if you don't understand everything right at the first pass. One piece of background I think I forgot is to say that these two sections, these two chapters that we're reading, come from a book called Justice as Fairness, a Restatement. And they are exactly that. They're a restatement of his original theory, which was a book called Theory of Justice. And it made such a huge splash in the philosophical world, in the ethical world, in the political science world. There were just hundreds of articles and debates on his book, and this is his refinement. Like I said, he spent his whole life trying to refine this theory, to find the perfect theoretical balance, knowing full well that nothing ever gets implemented in an ideal way, but we can be aiming at more of an ideal. And this ideal between the balances of protecting basic rights and liberties and ensuring that people have a fair shot or opportunity at pursuing their goals in life. And this is part 2 of this book, Justice as Fairness, a Restatement. We skipped part 1, which did talk a little bit about the original position and the veil of ignorance. But it's less important for our purposes, where we really look at his justifications or his evidence as to why a just society needs his two principles of justice. So this section starts on page 39, and it's a quick overview of his main points from part 1. And he says there are 3 main points that he wants everybody to keep in mind. On page 39, he says that justice as fairness is framed for a democratic society. Well, this is where everybody has political power. And he says one other way you can think of why it is for a democratic society is which principles are most appropriate for a democratic society that not only professes but wants to take seriously the idea that citizens are all free and equal. And that is one of the fundamental principles of a democratic society. Everybody's free and everybody's equal in a very specific sense. We'll get to that in just a minute. His second reiteration from his part 1 says that justice as fairness takes the primary subject of political justice to be the basic structure of society. That is, its main political and social institutions and how they fit together into one unified system of cooperation. Okay, political justice. What could that mean? Well, politics is just the rules of how we govern ourselves. So the most basic, the most fundamental tenets of society, its main political and social institutions, how they guide our lives it's imperative to try and make that more equal. So that's the subject of political justice for Rawls. And he also says 3, justice as fairness is a form of political liberalism. So he's in this classically liberal tradition. He is just trying to fix some of the flaws that have been perceived along the way. With those 3 review points in the background, what's important for us to focus on is how do we make sure that everybody in a just society remains both free and equal. Okay, so here's where we get into more deeply about the kind of equality that Rawls is referring to. This is also another way to approach his 2 principles of justice. It's another system of arguments. So if thought experiments don't necessarily convince you, or they rarely do, we can look at these principles as being justified in a slightly different way. And if we ask ourselves the question, what are people owed in the world just because they're people? And another easier way to say that is, what do people deserve just because they're human beings? And of course, we should reward people, and they deserve something if they've worked hard, if they have some sort of talent that society appreciates, or if they're very creative or innovative. But let's cut all that away and say, is there anything that someone deserves just because they're a human being? And you can recall the last set of articles we looked at with Nussbaum. She says we all have human capabilities, and we should all have the opportunity to fulfill them as best we can, even though some people have more capabilities than others or better at certain things. So, is there anything that all people in all societies deserve morally? Remember, philosophical morality is just to say the way the world ought to be, right? We have values as human beings. That's part of our constitution. And we often think that the world ought to be fair. So that if you think that, if you agree with that, that is something you think every human being deserves. It might never happen perfectly in practice, but morally, we think people ought to be treated fairly. And of course, many philosophers, especially proponents of individual liberty and human rights, say yes, people deserve their rights respected, their human dignity respected. Morally, as human beings, we are all the same. Nobody has any natural moral superiority to anybody else. Our actions can be judged as better or worse, but in virtue of the fact that we're human beings, we are all the same. And that's what they mean by equality. Okay, and if that's the case, as equal human beings, we should all have the same freedoms to try and pursue a very fulfilled kind of life. You and everyone else, because of our equality, should have the chance to succeed in your goals. And if we set up the world where only a small percentage of people have a chance to fulfill their goals, we aren't doing things right. We don't have a just world. We don't have a fair world, especially because nobody can opt out of social and political life. You're born into it, and the only way to get out of it is to die. It's the structure of the world around you is going to affect your life whether you like it or not. So how do we work to make it better for everybody? And this is where he says the goal of his two principles. On page 41, he says, given these 3 points, our question is, if we view society as a fair system of cooperation between citizens regarded as free and equal, what principles of justice are most appropriate to specify basic rights and liberties and to regulate social and economic inequalities in citizens' prospects over a complete life? These inequalities are our primary concern. And then I reproduced the principles of justice again. So we got to these two principles in two different ways. Then he spends a couple of pages discussing the logical concept of priority. And this is sort of what I meant, at least part of it, as to jargon. If you're not familiar with jargon, it can be very frustrating as to what somebody's talking about. And the logical concept of priority is saying that something is more fundamental than something else. So you can say, my belief in God is prior to my belief in how people should act, meaning that your belief in God is what shapes the other thing. It's more fundamental than the other thing. Whatever is more prior to something else will always, quote unquote, win out over things that are less prior. They are more important in some sense. That's not the perfect wording. But the idea is that if A is prior to B, and you try to do something to fulfill B that contradicts A, you're doing something wrong or contradictory. And the idea is that the principle of justice number 1 is prior to everything else. So if you're down in number 2 and you're trying to benefit the least advantaged members of society, and you try to do so by violating somebody's basic liberties, you can't, because number 1 is prior to everything else. It's the most basic or fundamental place that you can find justice. So number 1 is prior to number 2, and the first half of number 2 is prior to the second half to number 2. So they proceed downward in less fundamentality. 1 is fundamental, 2A is the next most fundamental. All positions in society have to be available and open to everybody. 2B is that the only time we can tolerate inequality is if it helps the least advantaged members of society. Okay. Okay, so how do we decide specifically what counts as a basic right or liberty? Something that's not in part 2A or B, something that is fundamental to justice or fairness. Rawls says there are 2 ways that we can do this. We could do it empirically. We could go look at history and say, well, we've gathered this set of rights through trial and error, like freedom of speech, freedom of movement, etc., etc. Or we can also do this theoretically, rationally, and we could think about what people need to have an adequate shot or chance or set of opportunities in life. And he says number 2 is more consistent and well-grounded. Okay, so he says, if you have the power as a citizen of a nation to help create the basic institutions of life, number 1, and 2, decide your own goals and pursue them, then your rights and freedoms are secured. Okay, so if you can help create the way people interact with one another, the basic institutions of life, number 1, and then number 2, separate from that, decide what your own goals are, your own ends are, what you like in life, what you value, and you have the opportunity to pursue it, then your rights and freedoms are secured. And that should tell us what counts as a basic right if we work backward. First, we'll take a step back and say, what is the good of a human life? I have been talking about that a lot, and I feel like I sort of tangentially referred to what I mean. Well, it's good to reiterate either way. So, what does it mean to live a good human life is the question. Nussbaum spent a really long time trying to figure that out. And we know that not everybody agrees, but there are some commonalities in the fact that we're all goal-driven, we all have specific values, and we all want the ability to work toward them. And in a democracy, we need to set up a system that allows people who have different or plural understandings of what is good or what is valuable to be able to work on their own good. We don't want to say one of them's good and one of them's bad. We want everybody to be able to choose for themselves. So here's one place where some commentators have thought that Nussbaum's capabilities approach is a third way to decide what basic rights and liberties are. It's kind of half empirical and half theoretical, and it has a wider view on what it means to have a good human life than perhaps Rawls will come up with. But regardless of what you think of Nussbaum, Rawls calls these specific things that help you to secure your rights and freedoms as constitutional essentials. They're the first thing we have to get out of the way. They're the most fundamental thing. They're the most important thing to justice. And we can't be concerned with anything else on top of that until we have these under control. And that's principle number 1. The constitutional essentials count as fixing up principle number 1. Excuse me, sorry. I was going to read you a section in the article, but I can't find it at the moment, so we'll just move on. Okay, so the first principle of justice covers the constitutional essentials. Well, what about the second principle? And on page 47, he says, the second principle requires fair equality of opportunity and that the social and economic inequalities are governed by the difference principle. Okay, so recall the difference principle is the idea that we can only allow social and economic inequality if it benefits the least well off. Okay, so I think I say this in a later slide, but if we need to pay people more to go to medical school for 10 years and become a doctor, as opposed to someone who is a janitor at the hospital, then that's something that we can tolerate. That's an inequality we can tolerate because it helps the least well off. Now they have access to good medical care because we have a set of doctors who are well trained, and that's the difference principle. Some of your opportunities in life, your possibilities to pursue your own goals, are guaranteed by the constitutional essentials. You have an open society where everybody can say what they want to say, all the jobs are open to everybody, and some minimum of your basic needs are met, food, water, shelter, etc. But then there are some opportunities that don't fall into these essential roles. And here we could sort of remind ourselves of the distinction we've talked about several times, of the distinction between positive and negative rights. And that's sort of parallel to where we are now. We could say the constitutional essentials are the negative rights, and the positive rights are more what we need to guarantee equality of opportunity. You might also be confused by his frequent mention of different types of justice. He talks about procedural justice, background justice, principles of justice, social and economic justice, and he mixes and matches all of these things. Background justice is one of the more important concepts here, and that's when he's talking about the structure of society itself, the basic rules and laws, like our constitutions and our national or federal laws and policies. And all of those things can only be just, or can, excuse me, everything else that justice can do in life can only happen if this background justice is in place already. Your rights and your liberties are secure. You have a world of social institutions that are fair to everybody. So now here we want to remember what a social institution is. Schools, laws, the justice system, the economy, our workplace, our media, the transportation infrastructure we have, parks and the outdoors, the arts, the sciences, religion. It's really any social group with a set of rules. That's an institution. We set up rules for how our social interaction works with any particular human interest. And it's only just if in all of them our background constitutional rights guarantee our free and equal status. And of course, the most fundamental is this original constitution, the way you constitute the state, the most fundamental rules, and they have to be in the background if we want to go and meet the further goal of pursuing our particular ideas of a good life. We have our basic rights, then now what? And you might think sort of that this is where we are in contemporary society. We have these background system of rights, even if they are not always fairly practiced. We probably would need to do a widespread sort of education for more people to grasp this kind of freedom and equality. But we do have some set of rights guaranteed to us in our nation. But what about distributive justice? And this is where we know things are incredibly unequal. So the question of distributive justice is, how do we distribute the goods of life to everybody? And you can think of a good as many, many different things. Oftentimes it's boiled down to wealth and economics. So we measure who's rich, who's poor. The rich people have a lot of goods, the poor people don't. But human goods also constitute these opportunities that you have to fulfill your goals in life. Also, whether or not you have access to healthcare, to education, to a nice community, to housing, to clean air and water. When I say fundamental respect here, this is a relatively new concept to us. And this means you don't live in a society that vilifies your identity so much that you don't have the ability to proceed freely in the world. So you might think of extremely homophobic countries that say they have the death penalty for someone who's caught in a homosexual act. You don't have the freedom to have self-respect in a country like that if you are a gay person. Sometimes you need encouragement, right? If you live in a subset of society that discourages education, that discourages betterment of yourself, you're going to have a hard time even formulating the goal to better yourself. So there, in short, are a lot of human goods that are possible. We can break them down into categories. We can think of them as physical. Physical goods are wealth, because you can also use wealth to buy things like houses, food, water, shelter. There are psychological goods, like self-respect and the ability to proceed in the world as yourself. And there are also institutional goods, which is when society has the infrastructure that helps you pursue your goals. And we could probably add in moral goods as well, what we value. You might value knowledge, you might value cooperation, kindness, etc., etc. Now, communism and socialism to a lesser extent want to equalize physical and institutional goods, maybe also psychological goods. I'm a little shakier on that. But Rawls and other liberals want us to give all citizens, all people, a fair chance at pursuing your chosen goods. So that would mean we'd need fair institutional goods so you could pick your physical and psychological goals and pursue them. Or your value, your moral goods. Sometimes the psychological ones are out of your control. And this is distributive justice. How do we distribute these goods? And he says on page 50, the problem of distributive justice in Justice as Fairness is always this. How are the institutions of the basic structure to be regulated as one unified scheme of institutions so that a fair, efficient, and productive system of social cooperation can be maintained over time from one generation to the next? Contrast this with a very different problem of how a given bundle of commodities is to be distributed or allocated among various individuals who have particular needs, desires, and preferences that are known to us and have not cooperated in any way to produce those commodities. Okay, so whatever the commodities are, food, let's say. We all know everybody needs some food. We all know people desire certain types of food or certain amounts of food. They have preferences of what they don't like and what they do like. They may or may not have, well, he says definitely not. They didn't help produce them. So we're allocating things that already exist. But his distributive justice is more fundamental. It's how do we shape everything so people can pursue these commodities or the production of these commodities that they value. And that's key, that we keep it intergenerationally and that we need this system to regulate it, because otherwise we might have what we have now, which is a concentration of power and wealth. So Rawls also tells us, oh, one other thing I forgot about this. Let's go back here. He starts to talk about why classically liberal understandings of this went wrong. And it's one reason is because they only focus on the justice in individual interactions. So he goes all the way back to Locke, and he thinks about Locke saying we start in this original just state where everybody has natural rights, and then we make laws to protect those natural rights. But it doesn't say anything about how it changes over time. It's only justice in each interaction, justice in each contract. But over time, if you do contract after contract after contract, and somebody else had bad luck, then you're going to be starting to accumulate that wealth. So we need both justice in individual transactions, but we also need justice on a more global, unified sense. And he says we're focused on this basic structure of society because of two things. We need to make sure that the equality of opportunity is maintained. Oh, I did. I didn't have to go back because I had it here. Okay. So just what I said. We need to think about the basic structure so we can think about individual transactions, individual lives, but also the future of equality in our state. And number two might seem very obvious. Other people don't necessarily easily agree. The kind of social and political world you live in profoundly affects the opportunities available to you. And you can often go to extremes to explain this to people because it makes it a little bit clearer. Like if you compare the United States to North Korea, the opportunities for each average citizen are very different because the fundamental social and political structures are very different. The definition of what it means to be a citizen and what is right and wrong politically shapes the individual lives drastically. So who are the least advantaged? So the very last part of the two principles of justice is that any inequality should benefit the least advantaged. And he doesn't mean pure wealth here at all. I mean, it's a little part of it, but the idea is that we all have primary goods in life. And wealth is, of course, one of them. He has a list on page 58. He says the basic rights and liberties. That's a primary good. Number two, freedom of movement and free choice of occupation against a background of diverse opportunities. Number three, the powers and prerogatives of offices in positions of authority and responsibility, which just means that every level of opportunity and responsibility is open to everybody. And then four, this is where income and wealth is, understood as your all-purpose means to exist, and the social basis of self-respect, which I mentioned a little bit before. So the least advantage in Rawls' view has the least amount of access to these primary goods. And this is another place where the capabilities approach from Nussbaum and Sen is often said to perhaps be a better capturing of what primary goods in life are. But either way, the idea is that if you have less access to these types of things, you are worse off. One of the reasons that Rawls focuses on what he does focus on is because he is narrowly focused on political rules. Because remember, way back from the beginning of part one, he thinks that what becomes a political rule is what everybody can agree on. Everybody can have a consensus on. And he doesn't think that's going to be very many, but the most basic values and rights. Because we have a plurality of views in life, and oftentimes they're all rational. Or, I can rationally want to be a scientist while you can rationally want to be an artist. Plurality means a wide variety. We're always going to disagree based on our own individual perspectives on almost everything except these basic political rules. But the capabilities approach with Nussbaum and Sen expands a little bit outside of those political rules and thinks that we could still come to a consensus upon them. So this is the end of part 1B. You don't have to worry too much about the technical graphs in the very last section of the difference principle. All that we need to think about for the difference principle is the idea that it allows for some inequality. And this is where I mentioned it before. If we need to pay more money to people to become doctors or to become tech CEOs, we can do that because it helps to benefit the least advantaged. It gives more people more opportunities to meet their basic needs or their, to get basic goods. As long as number 1 and number 2 aren't violated, 2A, we can have some inequality. Okay, so in part 2, when we look at the next chapter, our very last chapter, you'll see that he takes on specific forms of government. Like he takes on the Marxist criticisms or some of the criticisms that other types of liberalism have thrown against him. And for what I want you to think of now, I wrote it here. First is what you think so far of his opportunity to reconcile rights, liberty, and inequality. And another thing I didn't really touch on in the very last section of our selection, the difference principle, its meaning. He mentions briefly what he thinks about discrimination based on sex and on race. And the reason I didn't want to talk about it all that much is because it's part of the other piece of writing that you may want to compare to for your journal entry, which is also up already. It's Charles Mills' The Racial Contract. So I'll see you next time with Justice as Fairness Part 2.